Shavua Tov, everybody. I'm Kyle Solomon, and I've been a member here at Shaaray Tefila for 17 years. This place has given so much to my family, and I'm pleased to have been given the opportunity to give back in many ways over the years. Currently, I serve as a member of the Board of Trustees and bring greetings from President Liz Sherman, who sends regrets for not being able to be here and attend tonight's festivities. Shaaray Tefila was founded in 1845, which means that we are 176 years old this year. It's one of the oldest congregations in New York City. During our research in celebration of our 175th anniversary last year, we learned that the congregation, which began as an Orthodox congregation, formally joined the Reform movement in 1921, which makes this year the 100th anniversary of our being a proud part of the movement. This is a moment to celebrate, a time to stop and truly appreciate it. We are so proud to be a part of this movement that has been a wellspring of Jewish religious flourishing in North America and around the world. We are proud to be part of a movement that takes so seriously the things that our congregation takes seriously: raising Jewish adults, spiritual and accessible worship, and a profound commitment to social justice. That is why we are so honored to have all of you join us here in person in our sanctuary and online as well. If we haven't yet met you personally, we'd like to do that. So come say hello if you're here in the sanctuary. And connect with us online at ShaarayTefilaNYC.org to learn more about this community of meaning, connection, and purpose. And don't be shy. Tell your friends, tell your family about us. Bring them. Nothing makes us happier than to share our community and watch it grow. We are especially blessed to have some of the most influential leaders of the Reform movement with us in person tonight to reflect on Shaaray's legacy in the movement and to speak about the challenges and opportunities of this moment in American Jewish life. There are so many important organizations that bring strength to our Jewish community, including the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, the National Association of Temple Educators, the North American Federation of Temple Youth, Women of Reform Judaism, Men of Reform Judaism, and so many more. We value all of these institutions and our connection with them. Tonight, we have with us 4 honored guests, and I'd like to introduce them briefly before we continue with Havdalah. Cantor Claire Franco is president of the American Conference of Cantors. She came to the cantorate with a diverse background, having first worked in sales management before enrolling in Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion. While at the HUC-JIR, Cantor Franco was a cantorial intern for 2 years here at Shaaray Tefila. Cantor Franco served as cantor at Temple B'nai Shalom in East Brunswick, New Jersey for 7 years and is currently a member of the clergy team at the Community Synagogue in Port Washington, Long Island. Rabbi Hera Person is the chief executive of the Central Conference of American Rabbis. Previously, she was the CCAR's chief strategy officer, and before that, as editor-in-chief of URJ Books and Music. She served as educator and adjunct rabbi at the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue. Since 1998, Rabbi Person has been the High Holy Day Rabbi of Congregation B'nai Olam in Fire Island Pines, New York. Rabbi Person is co-author of Stories of Heaven and Earth, Bible Heroes in Contemporary Children's Literature, and is editor and co-editor of several other publications. Her essays and poems have been published in many anthologies and journals. Rabbi Rick Jacobs is president of the Union for Reform Judaism. A longtime and devoted creative change agent, Rabbi Jacobs spent 20 years as a visionary spiritual leader at Westchester Reformed Temple in Scarsdale, New York. Before that, during his tenure as the rabbi of the Brooklyn Heights Synagogue, he created the first homeless shelter in a New York City synagogue. Rabbi Jacobs is regularly featured in media outlets such as the New York Times, the Washington Post, Haaretz, The Forward, NPR, and CNN, among others. Andrew Rayfeld, PhD, is the 10th president of our Reform Movement's seminary, the Hebrew Union College Jewish Institute of Religion. A leading political scientist and distinguished Jewish communal leader, Dr. Rayfeld's career has bridged both the academic and professional worlds as Associate Professor of Political Science at Washington University and as President and CEO of the Jewish Federation of St. Louis. Thanks to the four of you for being here. I know Rabbi Mosbacher is looking forward to moderating what promises to be a meaningful panel discussion in a few minutes. And now I'm going to turn it over to Cantor Kipnis and Rabbi Reines to lead us in Havdalah. Thank you for being here and welcome to our celebration.
As the moon and the stars light our darkening sky, we continue with Havdalah. You should always use a pre-lit candle before a large event, but we'll wait, it's worth it. There we go. Before we begin, some words from Rabbi Rick Jacobs, not for this purpose, but he has written this. God makes this promise to Abraham and Sarah: I will make your descendants as numerous as the stars of heaven and the sands on the seashore. The Holy One wanted us to have more than a bit of part in the unfolding saga of human life. We need to be everywhere, and there needs to be a lot of us, like the sands and the stars. In a world starved for meaning and steeped in fear and pain, our tradition is overflowing with spiritual riches. Judaism can help us live lives anchored in wisdom and moral clarity. Judaism gives us rituals, texts, and holy days so that we can live joyfully in the rhythm of sacred time. Judaism gives us hope. We continue with our ritual to savor the sweetness of Shabbat. We hope you will join us. Words from Rabbi Haraperson. I bounce between the computer and the oven, trying to be productive on both fronts. The baking helps ground me as the holiday prep sets me aloft. It's a good balance. One is about soul and the intellect, the other about the worldly sphere of taste, smell, and visual pleasure. I have never tested this theory, but it often seems that I could not do one without the other. They are two sides of the same experience, a sort of necessary duality, food for the soul and inspiration for the body. Whether you are a sermon writer, tefillah leader, outline preparer, storyteller, cantor, rabbi, chanter, shofar blower, communal leader, or communal participant, may your service to the community be sweet, full of depth, and nourishing. Words from Dr. Andrew Rayfeld. From our creation story, we are taught that it is through language that worlds are created. This gives rise to a sense that all the world is an illusion, a matrix, if you will, of our own creation. And yet, even before God spoke, we were just told, there was darkness over the surface of the deep and a wind from God, Ruach Elohim, God's Spirit, swept that darkness away, if you will. In which case, light was not created through speech, but rather through the Spirit, action, and will that swept away darkness to discover the light that was there all along. Words from Cantor Claire Franco. We are instructed not only to sing, but more specifically to sing a new song. In his commentary on Psalm 96, Rashi asserts that this new song is a song for the future, referencing the final line of the psalm, "He has come to judge the earth." It is clear that the new song is an exuberant, joyful song of praise, meant to be greater than the song that came before it, as we pray that this coming week will be even more joyful, even greater, even more filled with song than the week that we are ending.
A good week, a week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase. A good week, a week of peace. May gladness reign and joy increase. Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi, Imhera Mashiach ben David, Eliyahu Hanavi, Eliyahu Hatishbi, Eliyahu, Eliyahu, Eliyahu Hagiladi. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov. Thanks to Kyle Solomon for helping welcome us, and I'm so grateful to my colleagues Cantor Kipnis and Rabbi Reines for leading us in Havdalah. Welcome to all of you who are here in person and everybody who is watching online. For those of you who are here in person, you might have gotten a note card and something to write with. Make sure you write down questions that you have as we go through the evening, and hopefully we'll have a chance to take some questions from the Kahal. Can I invite all of you to join me in welcoming our guests, Rabbi Person and Dr. Rayfeld and Cantor Franco and Rabbi Jacobs to Shaaray Tefila. We're so honored to have the four of you with us. I want to additionally extend gratitude to our teacher, Rabbi Dr. Gary Zola, director of HUC-JAR's Jacob Rader Marcus Center for the American Jewish Archives in Cincinnati, who found some wonderful pieces that I had never heard before, or seen before, about the history of Shaaray Tefila, a couple of which I'm going to share this evening. The first is a piece from a newspaper called The Asmonean, which was published in New York in the 1840s and 1850s. The item in question, dateline 1851, when Shaaray Tefila was 6 years old, is a little note about an invitation that was extended to Reverend Henry A. Henry. They used to call rabbis reverends back then. Reverend Henry was Rabbi Isaac Mayer Wise's predecessor in Cincinnati. The newspaper includes a note from the Board of Trustees of Temple Emmanuel here in New York, thanking Reverend Henry for, quote, the deep impression made by his edifying sermon delivered on Saturday, August 30th. And the very next article indicates that Shaaray Tefila, then called the Worcester Street Synagogue, had disinvited Reverend Henry from speaking on the following Shabbat. Why was he disinvited? Because, as the article indicates, quote, Reverend Henry had preached a week previously at Temple Emmanuel, heard the organ play, and thereby unfitted himself by this act from ever again preaching in an Orthodox synagogue. My, how times have changed in the last 170 years. I don't know what those lay leaders would have thought of the guitar this evening, Cantor, but we're glad that things have changed. So we're grateful to have all of you with us and to have you share your wisdom with us. I was hearing, as is true for many of us, for whom this is among the first times that we've been together in the sanctuary. Even for some of you, this is the first time that you have been together, even though you work together and collaborate in all kinds of ways. So thank you for making this one of your early outings in this time. I'm wondering if I could ask each of you to say a word about your sense, if you have one, of Shaaray Tefila's role in the history of the Reform movement in the last 100 years, if you have particular connections to the congregation, by way of introduction and by way of acknowledging that this is really a celebration of this moment in our history. Rabbi Person, can we ask you to get us started?
I actually loved learning about the history of the synagogue because in so many ways it mirrors the history of American Judaism. You know, this idea of sort of being founded as an Orthodox synagogue downtown, moving uptown, becoming Reform. I mean, how many of our families followed that same trajectory in many ways? So that was wonderful to see that. I think representing the CCR, we have quite a few very specific connections to the synagogue, not the least of which is that most Reform synagogues don't have a rabbi in their past who was a president of the CCR, the organization I lead. But you've had two rabbis in that role, and that's unique and special. And in particular, Rabbi Bamberger was crucial. He was not only an amazing rabbi, but also an incredible scholar. And he was one of the editors and writers of what in other synagogues it's called the Plaut Commentary. I understand. Here it's called the Bamberger.
Yes, it is called the Bamberger Commentary.
So that's no small thing. And that is quite a historical connection to have to the Reform movement as a whole, and the gift that he gave every Reformed Jew by being part of that. And in particular, Leviticus was his section, his area of expertise, and that's really amazing. And of course, Rabbi Jonathan Stein was also president of the CCI.
Wonderful.
So just that's a little bit
great.
of a connection there.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Afel.
Yeah, thank you. So can you hear me okay?
So I want to make sure everybody, and if you want to hold the mics, you can.
Is that better?
That's better, yes.
Great.
For people watching online, too, it's important.
So thanks everyone for being here. I just need to make one small correction if I could, because I want to give credit where it is due. The words that were quoted by me were in fact said by me, but I learned that from a drash by Rabbi Gary Mazo about the light being there all along. So I want to give Rabbi Mazo that credit, and I want to say, Rabbi, what a beautiful way of weaving our words into Havdalah. That was wonderful. So in terms of the history of Shaaray Tefila, I want to focus on something in 1895, two things that happened that Rabbi Zola also shared in that same email. And that is, number one, that you adopted the Union Prayer Book, the embodiment of our liturgy, of our theology, even before you were a member of the Reform movement, which takes some chutzpah and I think really shows the sort of the strength and the spirit of the congregation. And the second is that in the minutes of your congregational meeting of 1895, you talk about the need to adapt and to change in order to attract young members. And so the same things that were animating us then were animating us today, same things that are animating us today were then, that reform and change are an important way, not simply to respond to our times, but in order to have an eye to the future. And I think this synagogue has really demonstrated that in its history.
Wonderful. Thank you, Cantor Franco.
So my connection to the synagogue is actually very personal. My cantorate was actually launched here. So when I was a student at Hebrew Union College, this was my only student pulpit. I had the privilege of being Cantor Bruce Rubens, Cantor Shani, his assistant, along with Rabbi Harvey Teitelbaum. And I am very often quoted as referencing my time at Shaaray Tefila, where I really did learn everything I needed to know, much like my own personal kindergarten. Because Cantor Reuben was so generous of spirit and so secure in his own cantorate, he gave me sort of an open platform to explore things that many students don't get that opportunity. And in going forward, when Cantor Reuben left here and went to Hebrew Union College, he obviously gifted many years of students with the gift that he gave to me in grounding my cantorate. Your very own Cantor Kipnis has served alongside me on the board of the American Conference of Cantors, as have other cantors with him as well. So mine is a very personal connection to the history. So.
Thank you, Cantor.
So what a pleasure it is to be here and to be a part of this conversation about our history, our present, and our future, and the centrality of Shaaray Tefila in all of it. I can vividly remember the first time I was in this sanctuary. It was June of 1996. It was the installation of the new president of the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, Rabbi Eric Yaffe. And I remember sitting in the congregation, watching this ritual unfold, thinking to myself, this must be a very important congregation if that's where we're going to welcome a new president of the union. And of course, I sat there thinking, who becomes the president of the union? and I thought of that for about half a second, then got back into the beauty, the majesty, and the power of being here and being in that moment. About 20 years later, I was privileged to be back for another installation, and that was the installation of Rabbi Joel Motzbacher as the rabbi of this congregation. And I have to tell you, that was an inspirational experience as well, to see the continuity. As Rabbi Person said, this is a congregation that has had some remarkable and influential leaders throughout its long history. And it is, of course, the rabbinic voices that we know. But I would just say there's something about this temple and leaders I think, for example, of Mindy Davids, who was not only the great educator here, but she was also president of the Reform Educators. I think of the current president of NIFTY, who is actually in the House tonight. There's Lev Mosbacher. There's something in this family, something in this congregation. And of course, we think about all of the social justice. In particular, I can remember being in El Paso with Rabbi Reines. It was a very, very intense time when kids were being kept in cages. And a group of our leaders went to raise our voices, and there you were, Cantor. Cantor was always raising his voice, but there you were, Rabbi, raising your voice. And I remember you gave a beautiful teaching outside of one of the detention centers. I also remember being in North Carolina fighting for voting rights, and the largest delegation of Reform leaders to come to that gathering, of course, were from Shaaray Tefila. So the leadership is also from the lay leaders, from the professionals, and it's inspiring to think of the past, the evolution, the staying on the cutting edge, and it's most exciting to think about the future.
Thanks to all of you. We are celebrating this moment. I'm wondering if you, taking it, potentially beyond Shaaray Tefila, who is a Reform Jew who has been a leader of this movement in very public or private ways? Lay leaders, cantors, rabbis, you've all alluded to some people, but I'm curious if there are role models for you in our movement in that regard. People whose names we know, or people who we have never heard of, but whose stories we should know. So maybe I'll turn it over to Rabbi Jacobs to share if you have somebody.
We're allowed to have three?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah.
I did write three in the questions, so I figure I'd give people one and then they'll take three. If I offered you three, then you would take five, so.
That's true. That's totally true. Because it, first of all, is the case that there's so many that we could hold. I'm going to, first of all, think of Jane Evans, who was one of the most powerful and influential leaders of the Reform movement, I think, throughout our history. To be in the presence of Rabbi Marla Feldman, the current president of WRJ, is also to see the continuity. Jane Evans was the inspired president of the National Federation of Temple Sisterhoods. Right after World War II, she and Rabbi Maurice Eisendrath, who was then the first president of the UAHC, created the Religions for Peace organization. Because why is religion always associated with all of the divisions? Why can't we be a force for peace? And particularly I remember in 1957, although I wasn't there, she spoke at our biennial convention about the need to ordain women rabbis. Let's just do the math. 1957. She was ahead of so many of the important issues. She was a force for social justice, to ending unfair working conditions for children, and so many others. And she paved the way for the egalitarian Judaism that we love and cherish today. I'll just mention briefly Rabbi Alexander Schindler of blessed memory. There's more to say about him than probably any of the people from our past. Rabbi Schindler changed the course of Jewish life. He made Judaism for the first time in modern times inclusive of interfaith families, inclusive of LGBTQ individuals. He welcomed the first openly gay and lesbian synagogue, Beit Chaim Chadashim, into the Union in 1974. He welcomed Menachem Begin into American Jewish life when he became prime minister, and nobody wanted to talk to the new Likud right-wing leader. Rabbi Schindler said, we're Jewish leaders. We're going to work together. So I think of that. The last one I'll just quickly say is Zoe Turner, who was the NIFTY Social Action Vice President. Right after the Parkland shooting, she and a group of her peers got on a bus, went up to Tallahassee, and met with elected officials. And they went into one particular meeting. Here's this 18-year-old powerhouse of a social justice advocate. And the elected officials said, you kids, it's nice that you came up here. I'm sorry about the shooting in Parkland. Go home, do your homework, we'll take it from here. And this young woman said, excuse me, it says in our tradition, lo alecha hamlacha ligmor. You are not obligated to finish the task, but you are obligated to give it your best shot. So we're here, and we're going to hold you accountable until you do what is right and just and protect us and our peers and all those by having responsible gun policy in this country. And I'm sure he's still quaking in his little chair. And I think of these three leaders, there's so many more. I'm sure my colleagues will remember others. But we are blessed with leaders past, present, and future.
Thank you, Rabbi. Cantor, anybody want to highlight? Okay, that's fair.
So present company excluded, and I think that it is a gift to learn alongside all of our colleagues and leaders of our movement. I think for one that resonates for me and is particularly connected to my story is Cantor Barbara Ostfeld, who you may or may not know was the first female cantor ordained by HUC, and to hear her speak of entering sort of this all-male ivory tower and just how brave that was and how deep her passion and her desire. She talks about in her childhood being on the bima, watching her cantor in the robe and just wanting that so badly and wanting to be part of that and wanting to wear a robe and wanting to sing and wanting to bring that gift to the congregation. And she actually did it. And she paved the way for all of us to be part of our profession and to be able to take the gift of bringing our voices literally and spiritually to the masses, because she was brave enough to pound down the door of the ivory tower, as it were.
Thank you, Cantor.
I second the honor it is to learn together today. I just want to say, really a pleasure. So in order to answer the question, I just want to put up a little structure. Because when you say about movement and you ask the question, leaders of our movement, it's helpful to me to think, what do we mean by movement? And as I reflect on this, I think of really three things that tie movements together. Their institutions, their ideas, and their aims. And you can think about a civil rights movement. The civil rights movement, you had a set of institutions, the NAACP, the Urban League, SLIC, the Union of American Hebrew Congregations, and they were tied together by a set of ideas, namely something around civil rights. And you can get much more complicated, but that's the idea. And what were their aims? Well, they change from time to time. Maybe it was voting rights at one point, labor rights and equality, things like that. So if you look at our movement and you think of the institutions, the ideas, Reform Judaism, which is different than the movement, and in addition to aims, they also change from time to time. And so I had three people. Thank you for taking my first, Rick. As you said it, I showed hair. It was Jane Evans, visionary as an institutional leader. A good example of that. In the ideas space, I would lift up Herman Cohen, an Enlightenment philosopher, really one of the most important shapers of the core ideology and theology of Reform Judaism, based as it was on the primacy of reason as that which is B'Tselem Elohim, makes us in the image of God as the primary way in which we navigate the world. The idea that we are morally autonomous beings, that we decide for ourselves and have the responsibility to make ethical choices for ourselves, and that we should view Judaism, this tradition that we have, not merely for the beauty it brings for our own sake, but for the universal ideals it allows us to achieve. As I like to say, the good and the sacred, the beautiful, the right and the just. So that's Herman Cohen, one of the early articulators and the ideas. And in terms of the aims, I just have to share a story. So you all know the names of Cantor Sarah Sager, Dr. Tamara Cohen Eskenazi, and Dr. Andrea Weiss. For it was through their work that the Women's Commentary, what are the aims, what are we after? The egalitarianness. And the idea of the Women's Commentary was brought up at a 1993 WRJ, Women of Reform Judaism Assembly, when Cantor Sarah Sager urged its members to, quote, imagine women feeling permitted for the first time, feeling able, feeling legitimate in their study of Torah. Sager continued with a challenge to the WRJ, quote, if we are really serious about women's spirituality, you know this story, Marla, women's spirituality, about reclaiming our history and our voices, about liberating the concepts of God and community, of integrating the Torah of our tradition into the Torah of our lives, then there's something very concrete that we can do. We can commission the creation of the first feminist commentary to the Torah. So during a 1995 conference between the WRJ, noted rabbis, and biblical scholars, the commentary began to be fleshed out. And by 2001, HUC JIR professor of Bible, Dr. Eskenazi, had signed on as editor of the Torah, a women's commentary, and Rabbi Andrea Weiss, PhD, then a newly appointed assistant professor at Hebrew Union College, Jewish Institute of Religion, here in New York, joined as an associate editor to complete, and it was published, I believe, in 2008. And as a beautiful end to this story, Rabbi Andrea Weiss, Dr. Andrea Weiss, the co-editor, was appointed HUC's provost in 2018 and has magnificently conducted the ritual of ordination for our students since my arrival in this position in the spring of 2019. So know their names.
Thanks. Thank you, Doctor.
Good thing I wasn't going to use that as one of mine because it came very
You definitely
close.
could.
I think it's impossible to have this conversation and not talk about Isaac Mayer Wise. I mean, maybe it's a cliche, but he was the visionary and a complicated person, but the visionary who really thought up our organizations, each one of them, and out of his vision. So he was born in 1819, died in 1900. Dr. Zola will correct me if I'm wrong there, but I'm right. He had this vision of creating an American reform movement, something that was authentic to this country, that was authentic to being an American Jew, and that there needed to be a sense of unity and togetherness and a sort of shared core set of principles and values. And out of that came, like I said, each of our institutions, but more than that, since then, out of that vision came summer camps, synagogues, seminary, day schools, preschools, a youth movement, and of course, rabbis, cantors, educators, but also now too, Torah commentaries, prayer books, music, social justice advocacy, and just like the entire reform world that we inhabit today really sprung, he might not recognize it today, but it sprung out of his vision of what we should have. So we have to mention him. I want to mention somebody probably way less known, and that is Paula Ackerman. She was married to Rabbi William Ackerman, who was the rabbi of Temple Beth Israel in Meridian, Mississippi, from 1924 to 1950. In 1950, he died unexpectedly, and the congregation did something really unusual, and they asked her to step into his shoes. No, she had been, and this was very common in those days, she was his ezer kenegdo, like she was his helpmate. She helped run the synagogue, the religious school, so she knew a lot. And in that sense, it wasn't unusual at all. It made perfect sense to bring her into the role as rabbi, but we're talking 1950. So highly unusual move, and it was a move that was not welcomed by the reform movement as a whole. Many prominent reform rabbis spoke against this. Why? Because they worried that their wives might also want to become rabbis. Right, funny. But she apparently was a really interesting person. She served in this role for 3 years, and she hoped that she could serve as a model that would pave the way toward the ordination of women. She wrote, "I know how revolutionary this idea is. If perhaps it will open a way for women students to train for congregational leadership, then my life would have some meaning." It's just a wonderful thought. And then my last person, it was a really hard choice, but I'm going to just say a word about Rabbi Janet Martyr. Janet was the first woman to become president of the CCAR and really broke that stained glass ceiling in 2003. Prior to that, that's a volunteer position. She was a congregational rabbi and also worked in other non-congregational settings. So she's a really interesting model in a lot of ways. She actually worked at the then UAHC. She was the first rabbi to serve the congregation that Rick spoke about, Beit Chaim Chadashim, a gay and lesbian synagogue in LA. And Ultimately, she was the rabbi for 21 years of Beth Am in Los Altos Hills, California. One of the things that's important to know about Janet is that probably you have benefited from her work without even knowing it. Because Janet, along with her husband Shelley and a team of a few other people, were the editors of Mishkan HaNefesh, the Reform Machzor, the High Holiday Prayer Book. Janet and Shelley are particularly talented at translation. They have a beautiful sense of how to blend something that has scholarly integrity with a kind of poetic beauty. They wrote pretty much the entire translation that you find in Mishkan HaNefesh. They also did the translation in the new Haggadah that we just put out this past spring, Mishkan HaSeder. And maybe in honor of Rabbi Bamberger, I'll just share, because this is something that is not well known yet for many reasons, but they are currently at work creating a new Reform Movement translation of the Torah. And so I thought that would be a good, different kind of model to add to our conversation.
Wonderful. That's great. And there's names that we know and names that we need to learn. So thank you. Thank you very much for all of that. Even though Shaaray Tefila, as we've said, didn't formally join the Union of American Hebrew Congregations until 1921, as Dr. Rehfeld alluded to, there are plenty of historical documents indicating that many in the congregation were pushing for reform in the decades before then. An article from a newspaper called The Hebrew Leader in June 1880, entitled "Contemplated Changes in the Shaaray Tefila Synagogue," gives an indication of the various camps within the synagogue during that time, with some in favor of, quote, reform measures, while others were upset that anything would change. Fortunately, that kind of tension never happens here at Shaaray Tefila in 2021. Dr. Rehfeld already alluded to the congregation adopting the newly published Union Prayer Book in 1895 after a meeting of the Ritual Committee, the handwritten notes of which Dr. Zola sent and shared with us. I'd be glad to share with you. The notes, Cantor Kipnis, I want to let you know, the notes from the Ritual Committee that year, 131 years ago, outlined which prayers must be strictly maintained even as innovation is introduced, okay? The minutes list L'chol Dodi and either Yigdal or Adon Olam, Mizmor LeDovid and Ein Keloheinu. So I know that you'll take that under advisement. Again, clearly things have never stopped shifting or evolving in our congregation and in our movement. And change in movements require change in leadership, change in roles. I'm sure there are plenty of ways in which the role of lay leaders have changed. But I'm wondering, turning first to Cantor Franco and then to Rabbi Person, if you can speak each in turn a little bit about the ever-evolving role of what it means to serve as a cantor in a congregational setting. If we can start with you, Cantor Franco.
So when you and I first spoke about this evening, I actually alluded to the fact that I felt so grateful to start my career here because it was, I think, ahead of its time. Going back 25 years, it was just sort of starting that cantors were becoming sort of more partners in different areas of synagogue life. And Cantor Rubin really modeled that for me and talked to me about balancing those needs. I think the role has changed tremendously as congregations and society has changed and expectations have changed. You know, for the cantor of the 1950s and the early days of the ACC, the cantor really was the singer, was the shliach tzibor, but sang. That was your function, and if you came in and you sang, and you could sing, you had to sing beautifully, and you had to sing artistically, and other modes of music infiltrated into that, whether it was opera or most often opera, the days of Chazanut and the golden age of the tenor. And, you know, there was sort of a majesty and I don't want to say barrier, but sort of a loftiness about the cantor as the leader of prayer through music. So right around the time that, I like to say we literally came down off our pedestals, right? We took off our robes, quite literally, and we started to meet people where they were. In prayer spaces, right? The barriers came down, the bemis came down, sometimes we went into the middle. And with outside influences, and I think that's another question, our role as a Shliach Tzibur, as a prayer leader, changed. And then as congregations grew, and we started to understand that people came to congregations for other reasons besides worship, the rabbis needed partners, because you can't do everything by yourself. And I think, long story short, where we are now, in our training is different, the cantorial training is different, to allow for a cantor that's a full clergy partner, right? There's an expectation that you can teach adult ed, and that you can teach not just children for their bar mitzvah, but that you can get into the ECC and get into religious school and teach adult education and have an understanding of text and deliver a sermon if you're called upon to do so, and lead a funeral and lead a wedding and life cycle events, and that you can be a partner in engagement, new language, right? We're finding that how does the cantor engage the congregation? It might be through music, but it might not. I remember someone saying to me that you will spend less time singing than you will doing anything else. It was sort of in my last year at seminary, and I remember thinking, what's up with that? That's not what they said,
That's not what you signed up for.
In all truth, it is what I signed up for, right? I think that's, if you're lucky and you find the right blend of all of those things, it leads to great job satisfaction. I'm incredibly lucky to work with a rabbi that we're full clergy partners, and we trade off, and he sings nicely, and my associate rabbi sings nicely, so sometimes they sing and I speak, and we kind of like to mix things up. But yes, you're right. That's not what the brochure from Hebrew Union College said at the time. So I think right alongside the rabbis, and I'll turn it over to Hara to speak to that, but I think the expectations of clergy in general have grown exponentially, and the dark side is people are burned out. The positive side is it allows them to, explore and touch and engage with skills that they're excited to develop and use in a way that wasn't expected before. But I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you.
I love what you're talking about in terms of partnership, Claire. And actually, it's probably relevant to note that Claire and I and Sarah and Joel were all in school at the same time. Joel was in Cincinnati, so we didn't interact.
The mothership.
But the three of us were all in New York together, and it's relevant just in the sense of what we thought this was going to be about, and indeed what it has turned out to be about. But that idea of partnership and the sort of changed ways that we think about what a cantor is and does, and what a rabbi is and does, is so relevant. And I think we're still in many ways in flux. Especially after this last year and a half, really in flux. But, I think, so when I think about this, I'm going to actually take a step back from your question a little bit to say that in the rabbinate, we have an ever-growing percentage of rabbis who are not serving in congregations. And it used to be, I think, thought of as almost a shame or, a loss. But to me, it's really about finding other ways that rabbis serve the Jewish community and serve our people in a wider world and in really meaningful ways. So rabbis today, in addition to serving in congregations, serve in hospital and healthcare facilities. They serve on college campuses. They serve in the military. They serve in schools or different kinds of educational programs. There's something that we're today calling the entrepreneurial rabbinate. And of course, in nonprofit work. And all of that helps enrich the Jewish community and may actually sort of be another milestone on a Reformed Jew's path back into a synagogue at some point. So that's just important to note, that what rabbis even do today is so different than certainly what was one time the case. And within congregational life, the role of, it's very similar to what Claire's talking about. The role of the rabbi has shifted so much. Those of us who went to rabbinic school and thought that we were going to come out of rabbinic school and get to, preach and lead services and teach Torah and Talmud and Midrash, yes, because today rabbis have to be tech experts, and they have to be CEOs, and they have to know how to manage finances and read budgets, and they have to raise money, and they have to do pastoral care, and they have to worry about the building and the physical plant, and they have to know how to manage the toilet that always overflows in the preschool, and they have to move chairs in the oneg room or in the social hall, and and I could go on and on and on and on, and life cycles, and being there in the moment of emergency and crisis, etc. And so obviously not every rabbi can be an expert at all of those things. And people have different kinds of expertise that they bring to congregational life, but it is this sort of ever-shifting landscape. And I think one of the things that we do at the CCR is we help pick up some of those pieces once rabbis have been ordained, once they're out of rabbinic school. And that's because simply on a practical level, there's only so much you can learn in 5 years of rabbinic school. And there's only so much, there are really unique things that rabbis and cantors learn at HUC, and it can only learn at HUC. And then when they're out in the field, then we try to help them with some of the more practical pieces. So, for example, we offer a session with an outside expert on rabbi as supervisor, because we don't necessarily learn management when we're in rabbinic school, or how to do fundraising and things like that. So we try to help, or the technology, whatever, so many things. We try to help with, okay, you're a rabbi, you're facing this very different reality, and how do you keep building your toolbox so that you can function and really serve your community well?
Thank you for all that. There's various versions of an internet meme that applies for cantors and rabbis, I'm sure. A series of boxes. The first one says, what a congregant thinks I do, what my mother thinks I do, what the board of trustees thinks I do. I forget what the other things are, and then there's what I actually do. And the irony of that, and they're all different. A congregant thinks that a cantor does nothing all day but prepare to lead services on Friday. So the cantor is either preparing to lead services or leading services in the same way with the rabbi, but all these other things. And the irony of the meme is that they're all things that we are all called upon to do. And I am blessed to work with clergy colleagues who are I'm blessed to be on their team, and we have the kind of full partnership that cantor that you spoke of. Actually, Rabbi Person, you helped me think about a different question I was thinking for Dr. Rayfeld. I know this was a tension when we were at HUC, and I'm sure it's probably always been a tension at the seminary. But I'm curious, to the point that Rabbi Person was raising a moment ago, about how do you think about the balance between steeping cantorial and rabbinical students in deep Jewish text knowledge on the one hand, and practical skill training on the other, for the rabbis and cantors that you're training? On the one hand, seminary is 5 years long, and so it seems like we should be able to learn all of those things in 5 years, and at the same time, the time flies by. So I'm curious, from your perch at the head of the seminary, how you think about the balance between those two. I was aware as a student that professors had different ideas about how that should look, but that was as a student. So I'm curious how you think about that from your position.
Professors still have very different views.
I'm sure they do.
And let me start by reflecting by the talent up here. And the three rabbis, the cantor that are up here, my guess is you all think, or hopefully in fact it's true, that you're better rabbis and cantors today than you were the day after you were ordained or invested. We all hope so, right? And I believe it's true. And that's despite the fact that these were our 4 star pupils ever, along with Rabbi Reines and Cantor. And it frames the answer to the question. There is a general feeling, whether it's a seminary, a graduate school, or a professional school, and we run all of those. We are a seminary, but we also run other schools in professional nonprofit management, Jewish nonprofit management, in education. There is a perception that when you come out, you've got to be ready and all done. And I think that leads to the question, what is the balance? What do you want to give to people in terms of the depth of your Jewish knowledge and the depth of your professional skill? And I think what we're aiming to do is something a little bit different. And the question is not so much, are we providing them with enough knowledge and practical experience, but rather, are we providing them with the knowledge and practical experience about how to grow into the future? That is, the education that we give in the 5 years that the rabbis and cantors are here have to prepare them for a lifetime of learning. Give them enough exposure and enough depth to allow them to navigate where they're going to be. And, to that extent, I will tell you it's a perennial question. It's not a question that anyone is going to give a satisfactory answer to. But more and more I'm hearing our graduates say, when I was in school, I thought I needed more practical education. But now that I get out of school, I'm actually glad that I spent the time learning deeply. And the way that I think about it, the way that I frame it for what HUC is trying to be, we're trying to be a still, sacred space, a space in which you can grow and learn as a thinker, as a learner, as an exposer to our tradition and our text. And I would prefer certainly that we err on that side, because I think that the three of these, my colleagues, can tell you, once you get out into the world, that becomes even more difficult than honing your managerial skills and honing your ability to learn how to do, but how to think and how to be in that role is what we are aiming at, to prepare them for a lifetime of learning ahead.
That's great. Rabbi Jacobs, Dr. Rayfeld already alluded to this in a little way, but would people, congregational leaders or individual unaffiliated Jews, ask you why, in this era of post-everything, why should I be a part of a movement at all in Jewish life? What do you say to them?
First of all, it's something that I do hear pretty regularly.
I'm sure.
I'm sure my colleagues hear it regularly. It is the ethos of the moment that we are living in, where there is such a deep skepticism about all institutions. Anything that's been around for more than 11 minutes probably is in need of disruption. And I actually think that, to me, the reason to be part of this movement is not because of the history. It's because of who we are and what we do and how we bring depth and relevance to people. So, for example, the word denomination really describes a kind of theological set of beliefs, and those beliefs are policed. They're kind of very strictly codified. They're updated in a very formal way. A movement is a very different being altogether. And I just would throw out a tiny bit of demography, and that is the recent Pew survey of 2020, building on the Pew survey of 2013, said that the largest movement in Jewish life in North America is the Reform movement. How much so? 2 million people identify with the Judaism that we live, the Judaism that we collectively create and recreate over and over again. Again, this is not a boast, it's just the demographic fact. We're larger than the Orthodox, the conservative, and the Reconstructionist movements combined. Doesn't make us better, but what it does reflect is over the history of Shaaray Tefila, going back 100 years and longer, the Reform movement started out very small, very small. And in the 50s and 60s, there was a remarkable growth in the number of congregations. And then really into the 21st century, we hit our stride. So that doesn't mean that that's an automatic, that it's continuing. But what it means is when we talk about a Judaism that's egalitarian, that's joyful, that's creative, that's serious, that's ever evolving, and on and on and on, that's the reason to be a part of this movement. Not because your parents or your grandparents were or were not. And the majority of people in our movement today came from somewhere outside of our movement. They came from more traditional backgrounds. They came from, a secular background. They came from a different faith tradition. So the movement continues to grow, and it's enriched by all those who come and camp out. And to be honest, I don't think I would encourage people to be part of a denomination. But a movement, as Dr. Raphael was saying before, is something that actually shapes the world as it ought to be. And this movement has done that in a profound way and is still doing it. And that's why it's inspiring to be part of this movement, to add new voices. But it's not because the brand, it's not because, there's a URJ or an ACC or an HUCJAR or a CCAR little, kind of logo on the bottom of the website, which you do have, and I'm very proud that you do. It's because of what we are and what we are aspiring to be. And that's why we're the largest movement. But that will change if we don't stay on that cutting edge.
Thank you. That's really, really helpful. I want to make sure that folks here in the room have a chance to write down questions, and I'll look to my colleagues. If you have a question, maybe hold up your card so that one of my colleagues can gather them and bring them up to me. Rabbi Person, sometimes people ask me after a sermon, basically, did the CCAR tell you to give that sermon? Breaking news, they never tell me what I should. They are very helpful in giving me ideas and resources and texts, and I attend every sermon seminar that the conference offers. But I know you well enough to know that I know that you don't see your job as telling us what to say or whatever, but I'm curious from your perspective, what is the role of the CCR in helping rabbis to respond to the changing cultural landscape in which we live, whether that's Me Too or racial inequity or Israel or other pressing issues of the day? How do you see your role in the leadership of 1,800 rabbis?
2,200.
2,200. I have to update my statistic. 2,200 rabbis in this sense.
So I think I love the idea of like us telling rabbis what to do or what to say because,
That's why you took that job, right?
Yeah, right. It is the fact that the role of the CCR is to help strengthen and support rabbis so that the Jewish community is strengthened and the future of Judaism is strengthened. And so to that end, we offer rabbis all kinds of opportunities, both professional development kind of opportunities, as well as resources for personal support. Rabbis are lifelong learners, and whatever the topics at hand are, we always need to figure out how, Rick spoke earlier, he used the word relevance, and that's such an important word, because how do we connect the text and the rich history that we learn at HUC with the relevancy of today and the issues of today and the issues that the people we serve have on their minds. And so we offer webinars, we bring in speakers at our annual convention. So 2 years ago we brought, and this was to our great surprise online, we brought Abram Kendi. Last year we brought Isabel Wilkerson. And those are just some ideas. We publish books that both give rabbis a kind of a platform to speak, but also to learn from each other. We're about to publish a book called the Social Justice Torah Commentary. That's just an example. It's an anthology with many, many of our rabbis and also people outside of the movement thinking about how social justice is connected to Torah, just as an example. We work with the RAC on training rabbis, for example, in areas of racial justice. And then depending on what the issue is, what the moment is, we sometimes put together a task force, a limited, a certain number of years where we're going to study something, we're going to, out of that process, create new policy or new ways of working. And so, for example, we just wrapped up in the last year a task force on the experience of women in the rabbinate, looking at all kinds of issue. Well, it's obvious what it is, that's self-explanatory. But I think the other thing I would say, Joel, is that it actually goes back to what Rick was just talking about in terms of a movement, because that is very much part of this conversation. The idea of, what do we give rabbis? We give rabbis a place within a movement, and I think that movement itself is so important, because in a movement we have strength and we have power and unity that we wouldn't have just as an individual rabbi or as an individual synagogue. So if there is an issue, like you mentioned, certain timely issues, how do we as a movement come together and speak out on these issues, learn together around these issues, study together, and really actually in an advocacy way make a difference? We do that by being part of a movement, and the rabbis are very much part of that what it is to be a movement. And if you think historically, there are so many examples, but issues like the ordination of women, the ordination of gay and lesbian rabbis, those weren't things that just happened in one particular community. That's a movement-wide social change that comes from being united, that comes from having a core set of values like egalitarianism, for example, like inclusivity, that we share together as a community. So it's sort of what we do at the CCR and what the CCR does as part of a movement.
That's really, really helpful. We have great questions coming in, and while you have the floor, Hera, there's a question that says, you referred early on to a Reformed translation of Torah. How does a Reformed translation differ from the other translations we've studied? What will make it unique?
Right. That is the question. So when I say a Reformed commentary, and a Reformed translation actually is what I said, it's Reformed for several reasons, but one of them is just purely a kind of almost like a logistics question. Like we are part of the Reform movement. We are going to put out this translation. We are the publisher of the Reform movement. So we're going to put out a translation of the Torah. That is a Reformed translation of the Torah. Now, it's not as simple as that, because there are also, and I was just talking about the sort of the core values and the commitment to certain principles that underlies whatever it is that we do in publishing. That's true for Mishkan Tefila, Mishkan Nefesh, our Haggadot, any of the books that we put out, any of the resources we put out. There's always going to be these underlying principles. So, for example, we're not going to, let me put it in the positive. It's how do we translate language that has to do with God? How do we translate language that has to do with people? Now, it's not as simple as just saying, oh, we make it all gender neutral. It's actually much more complex than that. But that's part of, I think, what makes it Reform, that there's this commitment to really studying gender in this ancient text and figuring out what we do with that has integrity, but also speaks to a modern audience. What do we do with a text? How do we translate a text that is meant to be used, in a sense, liturgically, like during services? That's not just a text we use for study. That's a Reform approach as well. And we're bringing, and just as your Rabbi Bamberger did and Rabbi Plaut did in the 70s, part of what made that commentary so unique and groundbreaking was that it brought the best of modern scholarship, archaeology, philology, and so on, and blended it with the long history of Jewish commentary on Torah texts. It was the first time that happened in the English language. That's what makes that such a groundbreaking Reform commentary, that blend of the modern and the ancient. And so I think that's true in terms of the study that's going to go on behind the translation of the text.
That's great, thank you. Claire, I'm going to throw two questions to you that I think are related, and you can answer either of them, both of them, or another question that you'd rather answer, okay? So my version of the question was something like, how has the music of our movement evolved in the last 100 years, and how do you think about the balance between tradition and innovation? And a question came in that is overlapping, that says, will someone address changes in the Reform service, i.e. more Hebrew, more of the accoutrement of conservative temples? Why have these changes occurred, and what motivated them?
Great. So I teach an 8-week course on the evolution of Jewish music, but since I have probably 3 minutes, I'll let you in on a little secret. the cantors know that anytime the composer is attributed to traditional, it simply means nobody can remember who composed it. Because there is no single tradition. I guarantee if I went around this room and asked each of you to share the Micha Mocha that you grew up with, maybe some of you would overlap, but I could hear literally as many of people in the room. And so one of the great challenges, particularly of cantors who come out of school with this tremendous, we carry our big books and our iPads full, and we're all excited. We have all this new music, and we walk into a community that has its own tradition. And those traditions are held on to like dogs with a bone sometimes. And And it's always a navigating. So what happens? I mean, the truth is, Jewish music has always been influenced by the culture that surrounded it. Always. I mean, there's Turkish Jewish music and Babylonian Jewish music and Greek, and every culture that Jews have lived in, they absorb the sounds, the rhythms, the language, the meter of Jewish music. Made its way in the Reform movement. Think of Ein Kelohenu. It is a German drinking song, right? So there was a certain, it's true. There's a certain element of that weaves its way through every congregational life, right? So you were here, Cantor Rubin composed music, right? That was used, that was beautiful, that became a part of this congregation's traditions. I remember when I came and learned the Giverot, and it was a little, I don't know, what's the nice way? It had been
there was a unique version?
It was unique. It was a little warped as a student. I was like, well, what is that? So I learned that there was a period of time where there was no cantor, and the rabbi was singing, and that's the way he sang it, and that became the melody for the avot. So how does Jewish music evolve? Clearly the biggest change was when, as I alluded to before, we came, out of our robes and off the bima and down off the lofts, and the choirs appeared, right? Because prior to that, they were behind the curtain or the parochet up in the loft. They became part and parcel, and people wanted to participate. So Debbie Friedman, she should rest in peace, right? Gave rise to this whole generation of participatory, relevant, spoke to a generation of music. So that continues today. So just about 5 years ago, when the URJ decided to disband its books and music department, we had a conversation at the ACC, and I was privileged to steer the acquisition of Transcontinental Music Publications to the ACC. So we had this conversation about who better to influence Jewish music, who better to decide what gets published and how it gets published than the cantors, right? Alongside our Guild of Temple Musician partners, who are music directors or pianists, organists, guitar players, choir members who sing, and we listen to them. We listen to people. So, for example, coming very soon, Marla and the Women of Reformed Judaism actually contributed to sponsor a song in our volume series called Mikra Kodesh, Sacred Songs for Sacred Times. Because every Friday on the Facebook page for Cantors is, we're having fill in the blank Shabbat tonight, I need a song for fill in the blank. So we decided to create a series of volumes that would address all of those special Shabbatot, all those special occasions and things. Manginot 3 is coming out, so a whole new generation of composers for children's music. And so our third volume of Music for Young Children is coming out shortly. So we're meeting those needs. I think liturgical evolution, and I think this again goes back to being part of a movement and not a denomination, is there is space for each congregation to create their own traditions around their own values and around their own, what moves them spiritually, right? So liturgy at its finest brings people closer to God and to Judaism and to each other. And that the way that people will connect with each other or connect to God will vary from place to place and community to community. So in partnership with a rabbi, in understanding how are we going to move people, How are we going to engage them? How are we going to make them connect to us, to their community, and to God? We look at liturgy not as a static word on the page, but how we can interpret it and how we can deliver it in a way that touches the soul. And I think when that's done well, it makes people uncomfortable, right? I think the foundation has to be in trust with your clergy, right? Because I always say I can come in and sing anything once, and if people like it, great. It might become part of our regular rotation of liturgy. If they don't like it, I don't have to do it again. But they're not nervous that I have suddenly upended everything that's ever been sung at my congregation. The only exception is Danny Freelander and Jeff Klepper's Shalom Rav, because if I sing a different one, everybody has something to say about it, which I told Danny that when he came to sing with us. But I think that liturgy is in some ways responsive. So to answer the question about how do services change, or in some ways it's responsive, right? It's responsive to what's going on around us. We never had social action Shabbat when I was growing up, or Chaya Shabbat. Those weren't things, but the culture in which we live calls for us to speak and sing about certain things. And so we're responding to a need. I think, on a practical level, one thing we've learned, we've all been affected. Our attention spans are a little shorter than they used to be, right? We're victims of the 30-second soundbite. And Zoom and the pandemic forced us to really rethink, how do we deliver this sensory experience, this spiritual and emotional experience through technology, right? That already puts a barrier between us, right? I said wearing a mask, I hate wearing a mask to sing and to speak. I was so excited we could take off our masks, because I know that when I talk, I move my hands and my face goes and my eyes are going, and that gets lost. So how do we deliver a religious experience? But I think the short answer is it's in part responsive. And if you're really lucky to be part of a community like this one, or like mine, I will say that your clergy are always thinking ahead of trying to be not always reactive, to be proactive in experimenting and trying new things to see where they land. The diversity in the movement allows for diversity in music and diversity in prayer experience. And always our hope is that just that we touch somebody somewhere.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Speaking of thinking ahead, Andrew, I'm curious what most surprises you and inspires you about the people entering our seminary in this moment.
A lot. And in all really the best ways. We're living in a time with great movement towards secularism, towards post-denominationalism, the things that Rick was mentioning, towards a sense of wanting, particularly among our young people, wanting to achieve universal ideals. And I continue to be surprised by the number of people that still want to make their life's purpose and their vocation to be rabbis and cantors and Jewish educators. And it's simply a surprise coming out of the data that you wouldn't have thought it. But they still continue to come. They still, not in as large numbers, but we still continue to attract the most religiously liberal, of the religiously liberal seminaries, the largest group of people to do that. And I think I'm surprised by simply given the environment in which we're living. And it really speaks to what my colleagues have been talking about, the vibrancy of the movement, the power of it is drawing, and why it inspires so many people. They get that the institutions, the ideas, and the aims that we connect to, we're just stronger together. So I'm surprised by that, and I see that, What I'm inspired by, I'm inspired, quite frankly, most, and it's, I will say, surprising, I think, to us all, not just our students, but colleagues up here and all of you, but our students in particular, how resilient they were this last 18 months and continue to be. How resilient they were, how they showed up for one another. They showed up for their classes, they showed up for their professors, they showed up for one another over and over, despite not only the difficulty of learning through Zoom, not only the difficulty of an experience which is now entering into its second or really third full academic year, because it hit the end of one, then it was the full academic year, now we're on to the third academic year that it's touching, but that they continue to be at it despite all of their own personal challenges. And it gives me great hope and great optimism that the leaders of the future that we're producing are going to be every bit as good as the leaders that came before them. And let us all hope, if I could share in the modesty for all of us, that they're even better, because they're going to need that strength and fortitude to move us forward in the wake of so many other environmental factors that are pressing against the very work that we're doing and that we need to keep doing to move our world ahead.
Thank you, and thank you for leading this institution that is raising up the next generation of leaders. Rick, if I can pivot for a moment, I think one of the biggest internal challenges we might face as a movement might not be antipathy towards the state of Israel, but possibly apathy about our spiritual homeland. I don't know if you agree with that, but I'm wondering how you think about that challenge and how you think about the role the movement plays in helping congregational leaders with that challenge.
So I think it's a critical question, and it's so alive, not simply in conversations about Israel, but conversations, frankly, in North America intersect almost effortlessly in the complex questions about Israel. Two little data points. The most recent Pew survey said that 8 out of 10 American Jews feel that Israel is important or very important to their Jewish identity. 8 out of 10. Now, that could sort of say, Rabbi Mosbacher, we're okay. Thank you for the question, but we're fine. But when you read a little bit deeper, you see that the trend line going for younger is actually going to that apathy or the antipathy. Apathy is very problematic, but so is that deep sense of disagreement to the point of really feeling that the two largest communities on this earth, the Israeli Jewish community and the North American community, have, in a sense, somewhat grown apart. It's our job as the largest Zionist movement to try and do our level best to bring them together. I'll give you an example. This Thursday, Yair Lapid, who is the foreign minister of Israel and the alternate prime minister, meaning in 2 years he will become the prime minister, was in Washington, D.C. trying to repair the bipartisan support for the state of Israel. So when I had a chance to talk with him on Thursday, I thanked him for the following. I said, you are trying to bring together Democrats to join with Republicans to stand with the people of Israel and the state of Israel. We have an equally urgent problem to bring the diversity of the Jewish people together on Israel. And I particularly commended him because on September 29th in the South Hebron Hills, there was an attack on a group of Palestinians that was just horrific, including a 3-year-old who was attacked by a group of violent settlers. And even as they put the 3-year-old into the ambulance, they continued to attack. Yair Lapid raised his voice and said to all of the media, this is not the Israeli way, this is not the Jewish way, and we have a moral obligation to not only speak out, but to live our core justice values. So I thanked him because what you did, I said, in that moment and in many others, is you are bringing us together. When we hear an Israeli leader speak with a moral, clear voice, it helps. It doesn't erase the differences and the complexities, but it helps. One second anecdote. I was in Israel right after the rockets literally stopped this past spring, and we were on the Gaza border. And we were with our Reformed congregation right on the Gaza border. You could literally look into the apartments in Gaza City. You can see the laundry being put out. Well, I gave a Devar Torah at the synagogue in Nachal Oz, which is a wonderful kibbutz right on the border. And all of our Reform members from that area came together. So after my Devar Torah, a nice woman came up to me, and she put her finger out, and she said, I want to talk to you. Well, rabbis don't need to interpret. We, and cantors too, you know exactly what that means. I said something that was so objectionable that she wants to either correct or to call me in or out. So I said, please. She said, I'm a great-grandmother. I spent much of the last month in bomb shelters. Wasn't the first time. I've been doing it for over 25 years here on the Gaza border. I spent that time with my children, my grandchildren, and my heart broke this time especially. So I said, I can understand. Tell me more. She said, I think you might be guessing why my heart broke, but I'm going to tell you and it might surprise you. She said, my heart broke because all I could think about were the grandmothers and mothers and children in Gaza who didn't have bomb shelters to go into. And I thought to myself, this is a kind of moral courage. This is a woman who lives in the most dangerous place in the state of Israel, loves being a part of her community, but has such a deep sense of empathy. And all I could think about is, I want her to meet all of our young people. I want her to have a conversation, to be able to express what her Zionism is, what her understanding of Judaism is. I'm not going to suggest that's going to erase everything, nor is Yair Lapid or any other leader. But part of what is so problematic right now is we don't know one another well. In our movement, we carry our values wherever we are. We march for social justice here. We raise our voice for social justice there. And we have the ability to strengthen one another. But we've got work to do. And we can't walk away because the project is the project of the Jewish people. It's potentially the greatest project of modernity together. And this drifting apart, it can, I think, be addressed, but it's going to take all of us. And it's going to take us not telling our young people, but listening and helping them engage. Last summer, we sent more young people, more teens to Israel than in any year of the last 2 decades during a pandemic. Why? Because being there does that. We brought our Israelis once again to our summer camps, 15 overnight camps. Those kinds of experiences teach us the reality of what's happening, the power of what could happen, and the way our communities could grow closer. And if they do, the strength of the Jewish people worldwide will be greatly increased. But this is going to take all of us. But I know that all of us are committed to do that.
Amen to that. Last question, although there are many more questions, and maybe we'll need to have you all back to continue the conversation. It would be our honor. I'm not going to ask you to be fortune tellers or read the future, although if you can tell me what year the White Sox are finally going to win the World Series, I'd love to know that offline. But it is impossible to know the future. But I'm wondering if you could each take a turn in responding to how you think about both the challenges and the opportunities presented by this moment in Jewish history, even beyond the pandemic, which is hard for any of us to think about anything beyond that, but really, even beyond the pandemic, what keeps you up at night and concerns you, and what makes you optimistic about the future of the Reform Jewish community and Judaism in general? Rabbi.
Okay. I do like being a fortune teller.
Please.
No. Well, there's no lack of challenges, right? No lack of challenges today and no lack of challenges tomorrow. So I'm going to I'll just break it down a little bit, and I'm sure my colleagues here will add a lot more. I think that there are challenges ahead in terms of who are our congregations and who is our professional leadership. And what I mean by that is, if you look at who's at HUC today, there's a much greater diversity, and that's a positive thing, but there's a much greater diversity in terms of all kinds of personal identity, racial identity, gender identity, and are we ready for that in congregation land? So I think that that's one of our challenges. I think it's a great challenge. It's an exciting challenge, an important challenge, but it's a challenge. So I think that that's one of the issues. I also think that this moment, or this sort of year and a half that we've been in, has brought to the foreground things that were there already, that were bubbling under the surface, but have now been accelerated by the pandemic. And among those things are, what does it mean to be a synagogue? How do we think about synagogues beyond the walls of the physical building? That's a great thing, because I think it presents us with many, many opportunities that we might have been resistant to in the past. It's accelerated the conversation, it's accelerated the reality, and I think it's accelerated our willingness to take some risks that we may have been averse to in the past. So that actually is both scary and really, really exciting. I think that some synagogues in some areas with some capacity and abilities are going to really flourish in a new landscape, and I think others won't as much, and that's a challenge. What do we do about that? But that is the lifetime or the life cycle of synagogues. It's just happening faster now. And at the same time, I think there's a greater need for local connection and local services, and I don't mean prayer services necessarily, but just sort of pastoral services, all kinds of ways, social things, all kinds of ways to connect. And at the same time, we're beginning to see a kind of new venture of national synagogues. There's synagogues that are going national. And what does that mean? And how do we help synagogues maintain that balance between being the strong local synagogues that have the personal contact versus the big national synagogues that can do certain things that some of the local ones can't do? That's a huge question that both excites me and keeps me up at night worrying. It's been a time of such challenge and such creativity. So how do we keep that creativity going remains to be seen. I think one of the things that keeps me up at night is how hard this pandemic has been on clergy, on rabbis and cantors and educators, to be fair, and synagogue directors, and sort of the whole professional spectrum of who really helps move the synagogues. And I worry a lot about burnout. I worry a lot about sort of extreme demands on rabbis keeping synagogues going in this time of distance, and that's true for cantors and again, all the professionals as well. My job is to worry about rabbis, which doesn't mean I don't care about the others, right? Yeah, and I worry about mental health challenges with rabbis, their families, and of course the community as a whole. We've really deepened our resources for rabbis in this area. We have two rabbis on staff who also have mental health training. One is MSW, one is a sort of family practice therapist. And we offer free services to our rabbis to get confidential counseling, not long-term, but enough to kind of get them over a crisis or help them think through a challenge. It's become so much more important than ever before to do this. We offer support groups to rabbis, grief and loss counseling and that kind of thing, because I think we can't underestimate the toll that this time has taken on our clergy as a whole. That's something that keeps me up at night. But the flip side of that gives me hope is how resilience has manifested, how much creativity has come out of this time of being forced to do things differently, how people reach differently than before. People are willing to take risks that would have been unimaginable 2 years ago, to experiment, and also to sunset that which wasn't really working but was sort of on hospice care in a sense. We're learning so much from this, and I think that a lot of these changes are going to be good for us, even though they're going to be hard. But I feel like we're in the middle of an extremely rapid change process that might have otherwise taken 20 years, and we're doing it in 2 years, and that's scary and very exciting.
Thank you. Dr. Raphael.
Thank you for the question. Go back to how I see movements defined by institutions, by the underlying ideas, and by the values that they're aiming at. And I think we see some challenges and opportunities in all of them. For institutions, the biggest challenge that keeps me up at night is the fact that there's increasing growing secularism. And we are a religious movement after all. We are, to the extent that people don't identify as religious and only see secular. But what's the opportunity in this? If you drill down on what people mean by secular, they mean something closer to agnosticism. They mean something closer to they're seeking meaning and purpose, but they don't know where. And that gives me hope that what they're calling secular isn't the atheistic, materialistic, where everything's reduced to, to stuff, but that there is spirit alive, and that there is hope to turn those who identify as secular actually into people that are committed to our institutions. So that's number one. Institutions, ideas, and the aims, right? Ideas. The second concern I have is a rise of emotionalism as the driver of our ideology. The honoring that has to happen, as Heschel says, the empathy that we have for one another is God's way of making us aware of those not here. We feel it in our kishkas, we feel it in our souls and our guts. That emotionalism is important, but I'm concerned that it is becoming overshadowing what Herman Cohen talked about the primacy of reason to adjudicate. And when emotion takes first and foremost as not only something that you honor that somebody experiences, but that actually drives what we do, we have no basis by which we can fight racism, homophobia, or anti-Semitism. Because what is the racist or the anti-Semite but someone who really fears and detests the others? And if we're going to honor all emotions as the driver of what we do, we have no way to criticize that. And so I'm very fearful that as emotionalism takes over the primacy of reason, that we're going to lose our basis to actually get some continued traction on these issues. But what's the flip side of that? The passion that I see in our students and in people who are driven by emotion and driven by connection with one another by that emotionalism is a powerful engine of change that has to be and continues to be, and you can hear it in my colleagues as they describe it, even as we, to me, have to get a place where reason takes primacy once again. And finally, institutions, ideas, and values. The values of universalism that I see in the next generation, which are a concern to me. Why are they concerned? Not because they're the right ones to have. As Herman Cohen said, he was a universalist through and through to the extent that he was anti-Zionist, just like many of the Reform movement was. But by the way, so were the Orthodox for very different reasons early on. And that's a challenge because if we hope to have some sense of pride and connection as Jewish people, as a Reform movement, we have to be able to embrace the particular. So what again is the flip side of that? The flip side is that our students who are aiming at the universal, who want to fight racism, and God bless them for doing that, who want to care about all those things that we have to, right? Why are we Jews, as Herman Cohen said, and as we all have to embrace, to achieve the good and the sacred, the beautiful, the right and the just, those are universal values. They do so by honoring the particular, by the very identities that you talked about, their race, their class, their sexual identity and orientation. These are the things that matter. And so from that, I think that we can build a bridge where Judaism and our own culture, our people, our religion, our movement becomes a driver of the universal values themselves. Ideas, institutions, ideas, and values, and those three things are both, to me, the challenges and the opportunities ahead.
Thank you so much. Cantor.
So I have the unique position here of serving as a full-time clergy person and serving as the president of my organization. So I get to worry about two things at once. I think I echo what Harris said as president of an institution. I worry about clergy burnout. I worry about supporting my colleagues in a way that allows them to grow and change as the demands grow and change on them. But really what keeps me up at night is we have hit a point where be careful what you wish for, because we spent so many years in an active campaign to educate congregations across America about the value of having an HUC cantor or an ACC cantor, that we are short cantors to serve the congregations that want us. And I worry about that because a congregation will come to placement and understand that in a year they might not get somebody, but eventually we lose them. And I worry that the loss of the connection or being disappointed in a system that doesn't deliver them the clergy that they want somehow will alienate them from our movement. So that sits very heavily on me. I've had the privilege of speaking at ordination for the last few years prior to the pandemic, and I've actually said to my friends and colleagues, everybody should go to ordination at the 10, 15, 20, 25-year mark of your service, because any time that you feel burned out, go sit and watch that next class, step onto that bema. I get goosebumps. And soak in their pure joy and awe and readiness to serve the Jewish people. And that gives me hope. Like you, Andrew, watching our students and the next generation of clergy, and also the next generation of young Jews, because while I believe in many ways their values are universal, but isn't that actually what we taught them to be, right? As parents, we taught them to be universal. Our culture inspired them to be universal. But I do find that when you dig in there, Judaism is in there as well. And as long as we can capture, and that's the challenge, capture that Jewish part of their identity, they are hungry for connection and commitment and passion and inspiration. And that gives me a lot of hope.
Thank you so much, Cantor. And finally, Rabbi Jacobs.
So I have a lot more hope than I have fear. But I do know that this moment has been so painful for so many, and it has accelerated change that we have not seen, I don't believe, in probably a millennia. It has helped our movement. Even the places where there's been the deepest resistance to change, as soon as the first of the two pandemics, there's of course the pandemic of COVID-19, there's the pandemic of hate, bigotry, racism, and anti-Semitism, also killing and threatening all that we care about. But the congregations that have been so resistant are waving their arms saying, can you help us transform? I say, excuse me, did you say transform? What about just changing, the melody for Ein Keloheinu? Transform is a much bigger, scarier thing. People know in any form of leadership, whether it be professional leadership, lay leadership, that things as they are not adapting quickly enough. And I think what we saw, for example, during the beginning of the pandemic, more people were hungry. It said in this morning's parashah, Vayihi Ra'av Ba'aretz, there was a famine in the land. There was a famine. People were hungry for connection, for meaning, for purpose, for moral and spiritual, regeneration. And they came looking in many ways to us. And they joined us virtually. And it was easy to test the waters. For me to walk into a new community, if I don't know it, is scary. I don't know enough. Maybe I look different. Maybe I won't be welcome. But I could show up online. I could test the waters. I could hear the messages and say, you know what? This is a place, this is a community that could really feed my soul. Genesis talks about, and particularly this morning, and next week as well, we weren't put on the earth to take up space. We have a sacred mission. We're to be people who shape a more just and holy and compassionate world. We feel that urgently, and the number of people who come to feel it with us is growing. The expansion, the feeling of the diversity gives us strength. As the world's tearing itself apart, our congregations, our communities can be places where we learn how to argue, how to love arguing, how to love while we're arguing, how to be a community of diversity and hope and purpose and change and experimentation. All the things that made the Reform movement the great movement that it is today, all those things are going to help us going forward. But it's going to take us to let go of what has been, to stop saying to the young people over and over again, why aren't you more like us? The answer is, I don't know about you, I'm not exactly as my parents or grandparents. We need to create a little bit more space for there to be regeneration, reimagination, a rebooting of how we do this holy work. The holy work at its core is common to what was, but the way we're going to express it, the way we're going to build community, and it's not only buildings, is going to take a different level of imagination. I'm confident that's who we are in our DNA, and that's who we will be. And if I could just say, that's who Shaaray Tefila has always been. And so we look to you to continue your long journey of imagination, of experimentation, but of excellence and of courage, because that's how this community not only has survived, but thrived. And we know that our movement can as well if we do it together. As I know with my colleagues, there's such a feeling of possibility when we are aligned, not identical, but aligned to shape that future, to shape that movement. It's exciting, it's daunting, it's ours to do. I know we will do it together.
So many challenges, so many opportunities, and we are blessed to be led by Rabbi Rick Jacobs, Cantor Claire Franco, Dr. Andrew Rayfeld, and Rabbi Hera Person. Can you join me in thanking them for their wisdom? Thank you for being our teachers of Torah tonight and all of the time. Thanks to all of you for being here. Those who watched online, we're grateful to have you with us, and may we be together for many more happy occasions. Thank you all. We're going to invite our enhanced members and members of our Board of Trustees to make their way next door to schmooze a little bit further. We're grateful to all of you for being here this evening. Shavua Tov, have a wonderful evening, and thanks for being here.